Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today for a very exciting webinar with Joe Ganzi, as you can see. Joe is the president of eLearning Joe, a custom learning company in the US, and has been involved in every aspect of learning development for almost 30 years now. In today's session, he will speak on the important topic of getting the necessary answers before you start a new learning project. Get started then. Over to you, Joe.
All right, well, thank you very much. I appreciate everyone who's here. If you have any questions whatsoever, you're welcome to ask them in the chat, and I'll try to answer them when I can. But if you have any questions that are related to other parts of the session, you may be asked to wait a little bit. But yeah, we're going to now go ahead and talk to you about what is this topic all about. Well, I've been teaching a lot of classes over the years on using tools, different kinds of tools. Raptivity is a tool, of course, and there's Captivate, Storyline, Lectora. There are other tools out there, and I've taught most of them. And in those classes, which usually were face-to-face before the pandemic, of course, but also online, I found to my surprise that many times the people who were my students were sent there by their bosses, and they were new in their role, and they were told, okay, go learn this tool now so you can create e-learning. Well, that was strange, because at the same time that they were expected to use a tool, they didn't know really what e-learning was or how to make it work. And so it's a little bit like giving someone a hammer and a saw and say, go build me a house. Unless that person knows how to build a house, they're not going to be very successful just because they have the tools. So these are the questions that you need to ask before you start. And then from these, you'll have a much easier time creating your learning. So let me start by saying the following. Okay, let me go ahead. Hi. If you don't get the answer to these questions, it really can lead to a lot of problems. And I've been doing this a long time, so I'm going to relate to you a few of these different kinds of problems I've seen happen. It does lead to lost money and lost time. It can also mean that your e-learning is never really used. Now, I'll give you one quick story now. When I was working at one time for a company, it was a petroleum company, and they brought me in to work on that project halfway through it. So in other words, they started about a year before, and then after another year, we were done. So it was a 2-year project, and I was brought in halfway. Well, when I was brought in, they were already creating the e-learning. They just needed extra help. And so I helped to manage and also to create. And it looked great. We thought the e-learning was really, really good. Well, unbeknownst to me, because it was supposed to happen a year before, when it was delivered to the refinery workers, guess what happened? They never used it. They said, we don't need this. We would not have asked you for this. If you had asked us what we needed, we would have told you. And so in the end, they thought they did the right thing, and it was beautiful e-learning, but it was never used. And that was $1 million and about 2 years with lots of people working on it for about 70 lessons. It was really big. And in the end, it was never used. And that's the sort of thing that can happen sometimes on a smaller scale, but certainly happens a lot more often when we don't ask the right questions. The e-learning can be awful too, because you didn't prepare for it. It could be a house that's about to fall down because it may look nice, but then as soon as you walk in the door, boom, the whole thing falls on top of you. Well, that's the sort of thing that we want to avoid. You can even have e-learning that's hated. People hate it. And listen, e-learning has always been a bit of a stepchild in the sense that, people don't shine to it right away. And a lot of them will, in fact, be prepared to hate it even before they see it, because they've had bad experiences before. So we want to talk about the first question, which is, of course, who is your audience? Now, some of the questions that you're going to be seeing here now is, okay, fix the ratio. Okay, good. Some of the questions that you are seeing now, you may already have thought of, but there are others here that I think you're going to be a little surprised by. So let's go ahead and start with the first one. Well, as we said, what do they really need? If you don't know that, how are you possibly going to give them what they need if you don't know what they need? So you want to ask them. You want to ask the management, of course, but you also want to ask the workers, where are the problems that occur? You can take the responsibility of making sure that you are addressing the actual needs of the learners. And of course, you should get the permission of the manager, but go talk to those people and say, what is causing you problems during the day? What is it that makes you slow down? What is it that makes you not so productive or efficient? What is it that makes you go crazy sometimes? When you get those answers, and you may bring that to the management, they may be surprised. Oh, gosh, they never told me that, or whatever. It can be a surprise to them. So find out what they really need, not just what you're told they need, but really find out what they need, because that's going to help you a lot farther down. The truth is that you may be told by management, you must create this course. And if you have any power to be able to talk to the people, and you find out that's not really what they need at all, they need something else. If you don't ask that question, then in the end, it's going to be rejected. And who's going to be blamed? You will, not the manager. Okay. They'll say, oh, it's the fault of the instructional designer. Okay. All right. What is their native language? Now, this is one that if you've ever done multi-language type of e-learning or training, you certainly know this one. But if you haven't, this may be a bit of a new one to you, because the native language aspect is very, very important if you're trying to set up an equal playing field for everybody. You want anybody with any language, their primary language, to be able to take your learning. It's true that English has become, in essence, the universal language. And so, English is probably the number one language used for e-learning. In fact, I'm sure of it. But having said that, if you are going to be delivering to countries, for instance, that are primary Spanish speaking or Chinese or any other language, you want to make sure that you know ahead of time whether or not you need to deliver in that language. I've done many of these. I did one for a fast food chain here in the United States, 34 different languages. I did, excuse me, I did one recently for a university. It was about COVID, but they had a lot of different language speakers in their student body and faculty. And so we had to deliver that one, especially in, believe it or not, Creole, which is the native language of Haiti, or I forget, but Spanish and others as well. But yes, it's sometimes interesting the kinds of languages you have to support. If you don't know that, you can really cause yourself to have to go back and make so many changes later that it becomes a nightmare. What is the culture of the learning audience? Now, the culture is important too, because you don't want to assume anything with the learner audience. If your learner audience is varied, you want to make sure that you are going to be able to speak to their culture in a sense, or at least avoid speaking to other cultures. So real quick example, if it's the United States and we use terms like you hit a home run or touchdown, these are sports terms that have become part of the common parlance of the people, right? When we say to somebody, you hit a home run, that's the same thing as saying you succeeded. You did really, really well. Now, I don't know, maybe outside of France and Korea and United States and Canada, baseball is not as much played in other countries, right? So they may not know those terms, especially in English. So you may, if your primary audience is going to be, for instance, in India, you want to make sure that you're using maybe cricket terms, or avoid those kinds of terms altogether, which is not that easy to do sometimes because they are really part of how we think. The culture is not something that we are conscious of. We just are who we are. And if we have grown up thinking in terms of different sports sayings, things we say in sports, we may not even realize it when we're saying it, that that's specific to a sport. So that's just one example, but there's a lot of other things about the culture as well. I worked for a company in Denmark where they had many engineers coming from all over the world to their center there to learn about many things. And they had dormitories there and so on, because it was not in Copenhagen, it was a bit out of the way. So they had a dormitory set up, and every time a new culture, a country was brought in, every time they brought in engineers, they usually came from one part of the world. It might have been China or Middle East or some other place. And so by doing that, they then made the dormitories more culturally acceptable to them, So they were able to very quickly change things as well. So for instance, for when they came from Muslim countries in the Middle East, especially, they made sure that they had prayer mats and an arrow pointing to Mecca, things like that. So it was very, very eye-opening for me. What are their literacy levels? Now, this is real simple. I mean, can they read and understand the language at the level of high school or college, university, PhD? You don't want to be delivering to a PhD, a doctorate candidate, something that is really meant for children. Or you don't want to give the children what's really meant for a doctorate candidate. So you want to make sure that you're using the literacy levels that are appropriate for your audience. Okay, how diverse is your learner audience? Now, diversity is a big issue in the United States because we are a very diverse country. We have lots of different people with lots of different cultures and skin color and religion and all those things can be quite diverse in this country. And most countries in the world are becoming more diverse all the time. Some of them are already very diverse. Other ones, not so much yet, but they will become that because everybody is moving everywhere, right? In fact, Dennis, I'm about to discuss that very thing. What about religious symbols? Religious symbols are something that I never thought of using in an e-learning course, but for a different company in Denmark, when I was over there, I did work for a chemical company over there, and they were doing the instructional design part, and I was actually just developing it for them, okay, making it work on the computer. And I saw in the instructional design that they had symbols like, actually not just symbols, but they had conversations happening between God and Moses, for instance. And what was that about? Well, they were talking about standard operating procedure. And they said, well, this is an example of standard operating procedure. Here are 10 things you need to know, the 10 commandments, whatever. Well, I thought that was interesting. And I said, well, in the United States, we would not use this because, there are different religions and we don't want to offend anybody or make or even have anybody not understand what we're talking about. They said, oh, no, but Denmark is a very secular country. We don't really practice religion here. So these are symbols for us, just like any mythology would be. Oh, well, all right. And they had no problem with it. So we did use those kinds of examples. But you have to know that. And in most cases, it's better to avoid that as well. Okay. Let's go on to then. How will their time be spent in learning? By the way, the first questions are where we're spending a lot of our time. The latter questions tend to go faster. So I'm going to be focusing mainly on the first ones because that's where you really have to have a lot of questions. How will the time be spent in learning? If they're going to be using your e-learning in snippets, 2 minutes here, 2 minutes there, 5 minutes next day, that sort of thing, that's quite different than they have 20 minutes, 30 minutes at a time to take the learning. And so how you create your learning, how you present it, it's very important to understand how much time they're going to be spending on it at any given moment. So if it's fairly quick, you may need to be repeating things off and on to make sure that they remember. But if it's not so quick and they get a half hour or an hour or so, then maybe you can avoid that. So again, you have to understand how their time will be spent in there. What is their prerequisite knowledge? Don't assume that they don't know anything. They may all know something, just like those refinery workers said they already knew all that stuff and that they didn't want to have to learn it again because they already knew it. Well, if their prerequisite knowledge is good enough that you can avoid talking about certain things in your learning, then that's great. You won't waste time and money doing that. But if you find out that, no, a lot of them really don't have any of the prerequisite knowledge, you probably need to include that at least as an option. How motivated will they be? Well, listen, e-learning has a bad rap sometimes because there's so much of it that is very boring, very next, that if people find out they have to do e-learning and they've already have done it before, they're like, I don't want to do that, But the question about how motivated will they be is important, because also, is it a question of if they take this course, they get some kind of diploma, or if they take this course, will they get a possibility of being promoted on the job? Or will knowing this knowledge that they're going to obtain help them get to that point because they're going to be better on their job? So there are times when they might be motivated, other times when no, not so much. And in many cases too, you have to ask yourself, well, how can I motivate them if they aren't already motivated? I tell you, the number one way that you can do that is to make sure that your learning is so well done and so interesting. Raptivity has, for instance, a great set of interactions that you might be able to include, depending on what your needs are. Other tools may also offer different kinds of things. And so I never try to focus on just one tool at a time, because that's the wrong way to look at it. You want to look at it as answer these questions and then find out which tools will best help me to get there, okay? And it could be a combination of tools. So, and I believe we have an upcoming webinar on that very topic. So how can I motivate learners who aren't already motivated? Make sure your learning is interesting from the very start. And that way, when they started, they're going, that's interesting. Yeah, oh yeah, look at that, that's interesting. Whatever. Even the most boring subject can be made at least somewhat more interesting if you make your e-learning itself engaging. And by the way, when I say engaging, I'm not talking about entertaining. You don't want to be having them do nothing but play games. Games can have a place, but games are just a way of getting them to that knowledge a little bit faster. So you want to make sure that you are giving them at least something interesting there. Accessibility needs is a big one. It's required in most countries now, I think, at least in Europe and the United States. I know of that, Canada as well, and I'm sure in Asia and other places they have now stipulated this. It's not a bad thing. Having the ability to deliver to everybody is just fair. It's the right thing to do. And so if you find out that your learner base, which likely it will, have people with disabilities, you want to make sure that you are providing you're addressing those. And that could be hearing impairment, it could be vision impairments, blindness, for instance, or it can be mobility impairments as well. They may not be able to use a mouse. Is your learning able to be used without a mouse, for instance? That's the sort of thing. Now, a lot of tools already have built-in accessibility help, but it's usually not enough to really make sure. There are actually, for instance, companies that will take your e-learning and test it for accessibility. And it's surprising how much they find sometimes, even though they say, well, I used all the settings in the tool. Yeah, but the settings don't address everything, okay? They also, of course, do that with websites and other things as well. But it's an important lesson to make sure that you are asking about accessibility needs and making sure that if, for instance, you have people who are hearing impaired, you may want to make sure that you have closed captions as an option, if not all the time. If you have visual impairments with blind people that need to take your learning, which is the blind population is much smaller than the deaf population, but they're there. The blind you may need to have audio that is explaining things that are otherwise not able to be understood. Okay, let's move on. So, let's go back to that one. What are the job roles that must be considered? Now, the job roles here we're talking about, you may have a company where you're creating e-learning for that company. If your learner audience comprises managers, line workers, secretaries, everybody, then you may find that it's not necessarily appropriate to deliver to the manager what you're delivering to the line worker, or it may be perfectly correct in both cases. So you want to check on that to make sure that you're able to address the needs of the different job roles. We're going to touch upon this a little bit more in just a moment, okay? When we talk about context and content. But let's talk about some questions you can ignore. There are questions that have come up all the time, and the answer is don't worry about these, okay? For instance, is the audience mainly younger or older? If you find that you're working with a very old audience who's never used a computer, okay, fine, you need to address that. But in most cases, young or old, it could be a 15-year-old, 20-year-old, or 70-year-old. They're probably okay using a mouse on a computer, etc., unless, of course, they have accessibility needs. So the younger or older, you don't have to change your content to address that. It's going to be the same for both. Everybody watches the same movies, the same TV shows, and so on. It's because, we are human, and that doesn't necessarily mean. Besides, when you get older, all of us that are older always wake up thinking we're younger. So it's just the way we are. All right. Is the audience mainly male or female? That doesn't really matter anymore either. In some countries, there's quite a bit of a difference in what men can do versus women, but in most countries, not anymore. That's changed. So male or female, by all accounts, don't need to have their different learning needs addressed unless it's specific to being a female or being a male. Okay. Okay. What about learning styles? Now, this is the biggest one of all, I think, because all the time we hear, well, what about learning styles? We have to address the styles that each learner needs, but some people enjoy reading more than they enjoy watching a video. Some people hate reading and only want to watch video, maybe listen to audio. Well, again, just because somebody is not real crazy about reading books does not mean that you can't use text on the screen, for instance. I'm not talking about a lot of text on the screen, but enough text that, it helps. So, in fact, one time I was in the audience of a presenter who had no text on the screen. She was just talking to it. And while she was talking, she was drawing things on the screen. And so she was talking about things that were technical, and yet she was drawing trees and plants and flowers and things like that. And I was really confused. And I asked her, what's that all about? And she said, well, it's easier to learn this way. And I said, okay, but if 6 months from now, I want to go back and look at the handout, maybe the handout might be different, but if the handout looks like this, I'm not going to remember what those things are. Turned out that she had an illness called, what's it called? Synthesis, something like that. I'm sorry. I don't remember the exact term, but it's one where you have your senses get mixed up a bit. And so you might be not just watching or looking at an image, you might be hearing the image. Or if you see a color, that color might have a sound as well to you, etc. It's hard for us to understand if we don't have that. But in essence, it's kind of cool, but it's also kind of disturbing. So it can be a problem. But yes, learning styles, if I give you a link here to Kathy Moore, and there are several other experts out there who talk about learning styles, they have been debunked over and over. So don't worry about the learning styles. We're all human. And unless they have a disability, they can take in content in many different ways. And in fact, you should avoid giving them content in only one way. Not just text, not just images, not just video or audio. Mix it up to address the needs of the content as much as the needs of the audience. Okay. By the way, you're going to get a handout tomorrow along with the recording, and as such, you're going to see a lot more detail in the handout about this. Okay. All right. Let's go on. So we talked earlier about the job roles, and that leads us to what are the content and the context. Different job roles may need different context for the same content. So managers and line workers may need to learn the same software, but different parts of it. So 2 quick examples. You might have auto mechanics, okay? You're training them to fix the timing in a car engine. The timing has to be good, otherwise it can make the engine run too fast, too slow. So fixing the timing in a car engine, which I'm not even sure is necessary with today's cars because I haven't heard of it for a while, but it used to be. The context might be, for instance, how to fix the timing in a Lamborghini versus a Ford Mustang versus, say, a Hyundai or a Honda or any other car. The timing, the way that you change the timing in a car might be somewhat different in different cars. So that's the context now, is what kinds of cars do they need to fix the timing in, and make sure that those cars are being addressed so that they understand how to fix the timing in those cars, so not just in every car, unless every car is exactly the same, which it's not, okay? Fire brigades, what about learning to put out fires, okay? Firemen, fire brigades, they fire, whatever, they go out to put out fires. They're very brave people, and they put their lives on the line sometimes. Well, the context here might be, putting out the fire in a home is quite different from trying to put out fire in a skyscraper or in a oil spill or things like that. So you want to make sure that, again, you understand the context there. I'm not sure if there are any questions. I'm not seeing any, so let's go on from there. Hopefully everybody's still able to see the screen. Okay, what are the objectives? You don't necessarily have to show the objectives to the learner, but you should know what the objectives are. Just like with any business goal, you have to know what your end goals are, your end objectives are going to be. And so the objectives in learning typically are going to fall under two umbrellas. You have your terminal objective, which is your main overarching objective, right? The learner will be able to demonstrate the steps to take in the correct order when checking for malfunctions in an air conditioning unit. Okay, that's a terminal objective. That means that when I finish with this course, I will know how to do this. The enabling objectives, on the other hand, are the step-by-step ones that get you there. So enabling objectives might be, for instance, the learner will check if the unit is getting power. That's a skill right there. The learner will check all the filters, make sure they're okay, etc. So when you are creating your enabling objectives, you all need to support the terminal objective as well, of course. They need to be a part of what you need to know to achieve that objective as well. So the thing that you want to use, if you haven't already started using this, is Bloom's Taxonomy. Bloom's Taxonomy has been around for a long time, and yet it's still the #1 way to make sure that your objectives are correctly written. Because the important thing about any objective is that it should have a testable verb in it. So it's not enough to say, for instance, that I will know how to do something. No, I will, let's say it's the timing again, the learner will know how to fix the timing on a car. Well, how do you know that they know? How do you know that? Well, you got to test them, right? And how do you test them? It could be a drag and drop type of exercise, or it could be a simple multiple choice type of thing. But in the end, what you really want to say is the learner will be able to demonstrate that they can change the timing on a car engine. So they have to be able to, you have to use a verb like demonstrate. Now, Bloom's Taxonomy, if you look at it up online, you'll find lots and lots of information on it. And in each case, you'll find a whole list of verbs. These are just a few of them. So at the very top, you have your highest level of learning. At the bottom, you have the lowest level. I need to remember things. I need to understand. I need to be able to apply them, analyze, etc. Well, remember, might be things like the learner should be able to define something, should be able to duplicate, should be able to memorize, etc. And then as you go up these levels, each set of verbs is a little higher order. So again, it's very difficult to achieve sometimes these higher orders up here. Mostly learning tends to be down here, but you want to be at least in the green section here as much as you can, okay? So that's Bloom's Taxonomy. If you aren't already using it, please start using it. It's very, very helpful, very helpful. Okay, what technology must you support? What browsers have to be supported? If they're, I hope this isn't true anymore, but not too long ago, maybe a year ago, I still had clients who didn't want to move beyond Internet Explorer 13 or whatever it was. It's sad, but hey, when you have a large corporation, it's difficult to suddenly make a big change like that so that everybody is upgraded to a new browser. You have to do it in the right way. So it takes some time sometimes. So your browsers, what about audio, video, not artificial reality. It's, what am I thinking of? Adaptive reality or virtual reality. All of these different types of media, can their system support this? Are they able to play audio. Well, nowadays, who can't play audio? But it used to be that some computers just weren't set up for that yet. Well, okay. What about video? Video could be an issue for full screen videos, for instance, if their systems aren't real fast. It could be slow for them. So again, you have to ask these questions too. What about mobile devices? Are you going to be delivering to mobile devices? Nowadays, the answer very often is yes. They need to be able to take this training on their cell phones, on their tablets. And so you want to make sure that you're preparing your learning so that they will work correctly there. And that means usually responsive design. Responsive design is where you're designing in a way that's going to respond to the screen layout, the screen size, et cetera, and work no matter what. And by the way, some companies will say that their tools are responsibly designed, and yet they're really not. Maybe they are just in a little part. Others are fully responsibly designed. So it's not something you can just assume based on a couple of words. You have to really investigate as well. Learning management systems, very big question there is, what learning management system must my e-learning be able to communicate with? This is the server side. This is the overarching. This is where you have your class registrations. This is where people sign up to take a course. And it's also where all of their progress is being stored. It's being tracked by your lesson, but then handed off to the learning management system to store it. Okay, so learning management system is the point where a learner typically goes when they start learning. And when they go there, they're going to see lessons, and each of those lessons might be built in a different tool, for instance. But when you click on that lesson, you're still in the learning management system. When you click the lesson, now you see the lesson that was created for you. But when you finish that lesson, you see that it goes back to the learning management system, so you can choose a different one. And in the meanwhile, all that information has been stored in the learning management system. So that's a big one. Now, that's using typically what's called SCORM, SCORM, but you also have nowadays XAPI, for which you need a learning record store. And I'll discuss that a little bit later. Another big question you want to ask is, what story will you tell? This is really, really interesting, because a lot of e-learning is not built around this idea at all. It's just basically, here's what you need to know. Boom, 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 you're done, okay? That's not really necessarily the best way to learn. In fact, when we were in school as kids, if we just learned, you must know this, bam, 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 we tended to tune out. We didn't really, well, okay, you're saying I need to learn it, but how does that apply to me? How will that change me, or whatever? But think about when you go to see a movie, for instance, and it might be a space, hero movie, and let's say Luke Skywalker in Star Wars, right? So when you leave that movie, you might feel a little bit like Luke Skywalker. You're identifying with the character that you're seeing on the screen. Or if you're reading a book, you might identify with one of those characters in the book too. And those, of course, every fiction book and every movie that isn't a documentary is telling a story. And a story has a beginning, middle, and end. It has, of course, human beings in a story that could be heroes, villains, etc. There's always some kind of a conflict. It may be simple, it may be complex, but a conflict sometimes will drive you to want to know more. So all of us love stories. Back in the days of cavemen, they were telling stories. They've never stopped telling stories in all of history, and we shouldn't stop now either. When we're creating e-learning, create a story around it. Now, let me explain a little bit too. When I teach those classes, I remember one time I said, there's an important question you should ask at the beginning. And someone said, of course, well, what do we need to teach? Like, okay, that's good. Yeah, what do you need to teach? Now, what about the why do you need to teach it? And most of them, like, what do you mean? Well, why does it have to be learned? What is it that makes a difference here? And they're like, and so they thought a lot. And one of the persons said, I can't think of any reason why. And I said, okay, well, what kind of company do you work for? Oh, it's a cable company. And what is it that your responsibility is? Well, I got to make sure that the people who answer the phones from customers are able to address the customer needs. Okay, so that's the what. What is the why here? Is it possible, for instance, that if they don't learn that, the customers might not get their needs met? They might get upset. They might get angry. They might even drop the cable company as a service. Oh yeah. And so the why factor becomes important and leads directly into telling stories. Because if you know, for instance, that being able to help the customer on the phone and correctly is going to lead to a success, but also there are many common ways that these employees will sometimes make mistakes when they're talking to customers. Well, those are where the customers get upset. Now you have a possibility of different stories, okay? So Emma has called in, John has called in, whoever, and they have this question. And the question is such that you give the learner some choices for answering it, or they can even type it in, but most of the time, you're gonna give them some choices. Now, the choices will lead to other possible choices as well. It's not gonna be linear anymore. It's gonna be navigating through a branching structure. And that is where, in fact, you have the possibility of creating really good e-learning. Because once you start building that kind of a structure, then people feel like their needs are being addressed individually. Because if they make a mistake, you may not even want to tell them immediately that it's a mistake. You may want to see what happens next, because maybe the next step, they might be able to realize they made a mistake and fix it, okay? And that means you don't have to tell them anything. But if they don't, at a certain point, you might say, no, here's what's happening. Back on step 2, you did this. Step 3, you did this. It's not as easy to build this kind of learning, but it's not hard either. And it can be done. And I'm happy to talk about how to create that kind of choose your own adventure learning anytime. So tell a story, make your learner a character, okay? Your learner should be, in essence, feeling as if they're part of the story, and have your learner solve a problem, which is what we just discussed. Make your learner the hero when they make the right choices as well. Okay, now the last several questions here are faster, as I said earlier, so I'm going to be giving you these, but I'm not going to run through them too quickly. Question 6, for instance, is what type of media will work best? Now here you have video, you have audio, you have etc. You have images, text, and VR and many other things, right? Augmented reality, virtual reality. Well, the thing is, do you really need those for the learning, or is it going to be a question of, well, let me give you an example, okay? I'm trying to think out loud here, but let me think of an example here. When you are choosing your media, you don't want to include video just for the sake of having some video, okay? That's something that is not necessarily the case, especially if it's video of people just talking, the talking head. People get bored of that. That's really silly. I did a project once for the US Army about what's called Combat Lifesaver. And this is the one person in every platoon who is not a medic, but knows enough first aid and also, enough first aid that they can help to keep a soldier alive who's been wounded, who will probably die if they don't get some help right now. But then the medic might be a full day away, before they can get there. So the Combat Lifesaver role is pretty important to keep soldiers alive. Well, when we finished it, they loved it. And the general that had commissioned this had asked to have a video of himself introducing the course. Okay, so we brought him into our studio and sat him down, and he had a script, and he was very stoic. He barely moved a muscle the whole time. And in fact, we tried to make him a little more engaging, a little more animated, but no, nothing doing. He was a soldier, he was a general. And so when we delivered this to the Army in the end with that video, one of the majors, I think he was a major or colonel, I think it was a major, he called and said, hey, wait a minute, I thought you were going to put a video in of our general. Instead, I'm just seeing I'm just hearing audio and seeing a still picture. I said, no, no, look closely. Look, his lips are moving. Oh, yeah. Okay. So that's how bad it was. Sometimes that's just a waste. Okay. Better to just put a still image up there than and with audio than to have video that's really not doing anything. Talking head videos, even when they are animated, can be overkill. You want to use video that makes sense for the content. And that may mean, for instance, if you're talking about handling chemicals, well, you're going to create videos of that if at all possible. If you're doing inspections of homes that have been damaged by earthquakes or tornadoes, etc., again, you may be able to get video, but in that case, maybe not. Maybe you'll have to create an animation for that. Excuse me while I drink a little water because I'm getting something in my throat. Okay, so what types of media will work best? There's a lot of information about that in the handout, and I'll leave it there. Thank you. Okay, so what types of interactions will work best? Again, this is a case of if you have interactivity just for the sake of having interactivity, and it's not really pertinent to the content, that may not be the best form. If, on the other hand, you're not using interactions where they really would help the learner learn better, that's the even bigger crime. So whatever the interaction is, look to see how best to address that. In the handout, I have an example. I don't know if I have it in here. I don't remember. Let me see. No, okay. I talk about a surgeon who, there's a new procedure for surgeons that they've discovered that really helps patients. And so part of the training is they need to choose the right scalpel and then know where to make the incision on the body. Well, there's a different ways you can do that as far as interactions are concerned, okay? You could answer questions about it. Well, that's not going to help really remember very well. You could point to the scalpel and then point to the area of the body where the incision will be made, and then the scalpel just goes over there and makes the incision. No, because that, in real life, of course, if the surgeon all had to do was point to the scalpel and point to the body at the right place, and the scalpel flew across the room, that would be very dangerous and really spooky. So you want to maybe instead have the surgeon, the trainee, click on the right scalpel and drag it to the right place in the body, just as he would in real life, more or less, and then make the incision there. So the interaction that you want to create should be based on, as much as possible, the real life example when it's feasible. If you think, well, the only way this is going to be feasible is everything has to be done in virtual reality, okay, maybe, but maybe you're overthinking it. Maybe it doesn't have to be that much, okay? There are examples of virtual reality I think are absolutely right. They have to be virtual reality, but in a lot of cases, it's not necessary, okay? What quiz or tests will you need? This is an important one because unless you know what kinds of tests and quizzes, this goes right back to the objectives, by the way, because those verbs that were used in the objectives are the ones that you're also going to use in your tests and quiz, making sure that you have the ability to ensure that the learner actually knows now what they need to know. And by the way, you know as well as I do that when you take an e-learning course or you're in a classroom and you're given a quiz or a test, all that's really helping you to prove is that you have good short-term memory. How much will they remember a month later, 2 months later, 3 months later? There are ways of ensuring that also are part of this idea of quizzing and testing that we can discuss at another time as well. In other words, when you take a course of any kind and you finish with it, you've graduated, but you're not an expert yet, okay? Expertise comes in the doing afterwards. And that's where you want to know how to best help that person after they've graduated from your course. What learner progress points must be captured? What constitutes completion? Again, this is a question of, simply put, okay, let's say it's a multiple choice test. Do they need to pass 80%, 70%, 60%, 90%, whatever? Or is it a question of how many pages or slides have they seen or red, or whatever the case might be, what is it that will allow you to say, okay, they've completed that lesson? And that's where you need to discuss that in advance so that you're setting it up correctly in the course. What will updates and maintenance be performed by others? Now, this is a question of, if you're now creating your, let's say you're creating a storyboard before your development or script, or once you've developed, once you've done those, you are now developing it in a tool of your choice. Well, the updates and maintenance really applies to all of these. If you create your storyboards and scripts in a way that you may not even remember yourself what you meant 6 months later, you probably want to make those a lot clearer, okay? Besides which, if you don't make those clear, the developers might not do it correctly either. Having said that, nowadays, most of the time, the instructional designer and the developer are the same person. But in the past, and even now, sometimes you'll see that you have instructional designers on one side, you have developers on the other side, and you want to make sure that the instructions are clear. For the development itself, in the tool that you use, there's usually ways to document what you're doing in there. If you're using an interaction, there's a place there where it says, this is why we're using this interaction, or other things like, if you're using variables, for instance, in your course for higher end types of things, you may want to make sure that those descriptions of your variables are really clear as well. So even if it's just you may not remember these things. You may need to remind yourself. But if others are doing it, especially, you want to make sure that updates and maintenance can be performed by making sure that you're documenting everything very clearly. What are the social networking needs? Well, this is one where more and more it's become an important part of e-learning. If you are wanting, okay, in the old days, if someone was taking a course and they asked a fellow classmate, what's the answer to that question? That's called cheating, right? If someone copied someone else's essay or homework or whatever, that's cheating. Social networking does allow for sharing of ideas. Not necessarily cheating, though. You might be able to really take advantage of the fact that people have their a special hashtag that they use on Twitter to discuss something, or it might be an internal wiki or other ways that you can communicate internally. And in this case, what you're doing is you're sending up lessons where in real life, they would need to be working on a team. They would need to be working with others. And if you can make that work as well using social networking, that means they don't all have to be in the same room. They could be in different countries around the world. And yet, they're learning how to work together as a team because you're using social networking to that end to help them communicate through the process. But you want to make sure that you're setting up your lessons so that makes sense. It makes sense for them to share knowledge and come up with solutions and so on, and not just for the sake of, hey, let's all communicate and let's give each other all the answers. No, that's not necessarily the case. Okay. How will the e-learning be evaluated? This is the last one I'm going to talk about now, which is evaluation of e-learning is not the same thing as progress tracking for the learner. The learner's progress tracking, of course, needs to be stored and reported on, etc. Did the class, if 80% of the class did well on it, 20% did not so well, or perhaps 80% did badly and 20% did well? That's a question of learner needs, but also evaluating the course. Because if everybody is pretty much getting things wrong, then your e-learning may not be doing it correctly. You may not be presenting it correctly, and that's where evaluation is very important, because evaluating the e-learning itself is something that it seems to be rarely done, because I think in most cases organizations don't want to know that their e-learning isn't so good. Maybe they already know it, maybe in their guts that it's not good, but they want to be able to just sort of deliver it and then forget about it. No, you really need to evaluate, because unless you evaluate your e-learning, how are you going to make the next one better? How are you going to make sure that the same mistakes aren't repeated? So e-learning evaluation of the e-learning courses is an important step to take as well. One that, of course, doesn't happen at the beginning, but does need to be prepared for at the very beginning as well. That's it. If you have any additional questions, I'm happy to answer them. I think as I said, the handout has a lot more detail in it as well. And I'm happy now to talk about anything else. I'll keep sharing the screen in case I want to go back to a slide as part of an answer. Dennis, too true about evaluation. Thank you for saying that. Absolutely right. And by the way, I've seen it go the other way. I worked for a government agency once here where they set up a department of 2 people to set up evaluation stuff. Okay, so they were using all sorts of means, and 2 years later, they still hadn't even come up with anything. They were getting so thick in the weeds that they never really got, you know, any results. You gotta be smart about it too. Okay. Oh, good, Michael. Yeah. I've been using Raptivity for at least that long. If maybe, yeah, probably about that. Maybe around that time. I don't remember exactly when, but it's a great tool, and I like the new version very much as well. So good stuff. Thank you, Michael. Okay. Other questions? If not, I'll be happy to stop sharing and hand it back to Sandeep and Manasi. And stop sharing. You can see video now, I think, right? So let's see. Okay. I'm still looking at the chat in case there are other questions, but let's see. Are these questions any different from micro-learning development? Okay, that's a good question, Poonam. Yeah. Thank you, Dennis. Okay, so the question, are there questions for learning, micro-learning? I did mention earlier about knowing how the learner will spend his or her time in the learning. And I said sometimes they just get 2 minutes here, 3 minutes there. And that's where micro-learning really excels, of course. You want to make sure that you're delivering things in a way that they can take it very quickly. Micro-learning is more than just that, more than just the time taken, but it is, in essence, underlying a lot of these questions that we asked earlier. It's a good question, though, and I think I may want to address that in the future, just because it is a question that comes up pretty often. So thank you, Poonam. Other questions? No? Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Joe, for a very insightful session, I would say. You've answered a lot of important questions there to help e-learning designers build the best learning experiences. Thank you to all of those who took out time to attend the webinar. We will be sharing the recording with you shortly, as well as a handout from Joe on the key questions you need to consider for your content creation. That's all from us today. Thank you, everyone, and have a good day.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Andrew. Bye-bye. Thanks, Dennis. Appreciate you being here. Bye-bye, everybody.